Hey, it's me, Bill Ferriter, and it's time for another 10-minute team tip. I had a friend reach out just recently and say, Bill, how do you build student engagement in an elementary school classroom? That's a perfect question for me. Whether you know it or not, I wrote a book just recently with a friend of mine named Tim Brown called You Can Learn, which is all about building student motivation, ownership, and efficacy of their learning. And what Tim and I argue is that we believe that the most engaged learners are those who are experiencing success in our classrooms. So our job as teachers is to ensure that all students consistently succeed. Now, none of that is particularly surprising. People have been researching the impact that efficacy has on learners for a very long while. Let me introduce you to Albert Bandura, who's done some of the deepest research around the impact that efficacy has on learners. And what Bandura argues is that when students can be convinced that they have what it takes to move themselves forward, regardless of the situation, they're more likely to be both engaged and successful as learners. Why? Because when a student is convinced that they can be successful, why would they quit when the going gets tough? Students who have evidence that they can succeed regardless of the circumstance push forward with persistence and confidence in ways that learners who doubt their own ability oftentimes won't. Now, what does that mean for us as teachers? Well, we need to build efficacy. Now, I can show you tons of research about the impact that efficacy has on learners, but because I'm trying to keep this video to just 10 minutes, I'm going to move forward straight into strategies. But please know that if you're interested in knowing what John Hattie says about student efficacy, I'd be happy to share that with you. I can tell you what Bob Marzano says about student self-efficacy. Turns out that lots of different researchers see the impact that efficacy has on learners. I just am not going to give you all that research right now just to save us time. Does that make sense? All right, now moving forward, what Tim and I argue is that if you want to build self-efficacy in learners, we should do it in the same way that we build efficacy in collaborative teacher teams. So in PLC schools, we believe that the way that you build efficacy on a collaborative teacher team is to get them to answer the 4 critical questions of learning. What do we want our students to know and be able to do? How will we assess student progress towards mastery? What are we going to do when a student struggles? And what are we going to do when a student is working beyond our expectations? Teams answer those 4 critical questions in cycles of inquiry, where they study their practice together and gather evidence about the impact that their own choices are having on students as learners. What Tim and I believe is that if we use those 4 critical questions with adults, let's start using student-centered versions of the exact same questions with students too. For example, we want students at any given time to be able to tell you what they're learning and why it's important to them. We want students to be able to tell you at any given time what kind of progress they're making towards mastering important outcomes. Students should assess their own progress towards mastery. And we want students to be able to tell you at any given time what they should do when they're struggling, they should do when they're working beyond grade level expectations. What Tim and I believe is that if efficacy is built through those 4 critical questions for adult learners, we should be using student-centered versions of those exact same questions in our classrooms too. Now let me show you some specific strategies you can use to pull that off. I'll start with an example from Tim's school, his last elementary school, which was Campbell Elementary. What Tim said is that we need to connect students to the mission of our school. They need to see that they're a part of something bigger than just themselves. So they turned their mission statement into a slogan that students could understand. They made their mission statement say that at Campbell Elementary School, together we're going to build a brighter future 1 brick at a time. Now, I think that's clever all by itself. But what made it powerful for students is they articulated specific steps that kids could take in order to build a brighter future together. Specifically, what they said is that you as a student are contributing to the mission of our school every time you give your best effort. And you as a student are contributing to the mission of our school every time you support your peers. And you as a student are contributing to the mission of our school every time you try again when you struggle. Now, all by itself, that's a win, right? Because students can be recognized for the individual actions that they take in order to move the building forward. But what I thought was really neat in Tim's school is that they had regular challenge assemblies where students could be brought together into the cafeteria or into the gym, and they would be recognized by their teachers with what they called a BRIC certificate. So if I saw students supporting peers or trying again when they struggled, I could acknowledge that contribution to the school with a BRIC certificate. You could see little man is holding one there. Those BRIC certificates would be hung into the hallway of the school, so they had a whole wall of BRIC certificates building over time. And then what was really neat is that a student who earned a BRIC certificate also earned a yellow hard hat that they could wear during their challenge assemblies. So what you ended up with over time was a community of learners, students who saw, I'm a part of this building and I'm making contributions too. And I know that I am because I can point to the BRIC certificate and tell you why I earned it. I also know that I am because I'm wearing a yellow hard hat and I can see other people wearing it too. That's a way to convince students that they're connected to something bigger than just themselves within the building. And the only thing it required was Tim being clear about the steps that students take in order to contribute to the mission of the school. I think that's a really neat idea. Here's some other ideas. Critical question 1 for students. At any given time, we want students to be able to tell us what it is that they need to know and be able to do by the end of our instruction. Whether it's the end of a unit, whether it's the end of a lesson. And we don't necessarily just want students to tell us what it is they need to know. We want students to also be able to tell us why it's important. That matters more than you may think. For example, when you think about what you pay attention to as a learner, it's the things that you're interested in. If we're not interested as learners, we're less likely to pay attention. By the way, that's not just because you're lazy as a learner. It's not because you don't care about learning. Instead, it's because your brain, your senses, take in 11 million bits of information per second, but your brain only has the ability to process 120 bits of information per second. That's not going to work, right? Your senses take in 11 million bits of info, but your brain can process 120. What that means is that our brains discard a lot of information. We intentionally and willfully ignore things. So how are you going to learn if you're not intentionally paying attention to things? What's amazing to me in the research is that notion of whether or not a student is interested, whether they understand why something is important, has a greater impact on their outcomes in school than teacher quality or poverty. It blows my mind if you think about it. Just getting kids to be interested in and to understand why something matters to them has a huge impact on student success and engagement in class. So how do you do that in an elementary school? Well, here's an idea from Howard Elementary in Fort Smith, Arkansas. They have students make self-portraits at the beginning of the year, and they pair it with a powerful phrase. That powerful phrase is, I will change the world by. And then students articulate what it is that they want to do to change the world in the future. In this particular case, Jose wants to become a pilot. Then they hang these pictures up all around their classroom walls. So on every wall you can see self-portraits of students. When a teacher begins to teach a lesson, they can look at the students and say, now let's remember why this lesson is important to you. Jose, you said you wanted to be a pilot. I wonder how pilots will use the outcome that we're learning in class today. Or if a pilot didn't master the outcome we were studying in class today, I wonder what would happen. I wonder how they would struggle in their career. It's a quick way to help students realize that a lesson matters to them. And if a student realizes that a lesson matters to them, they're likely to be more engaged in class. Now, how else might that work? Here's an example from a group of teachers in Little Rock, Arkansas, who built a career corner. Same idea. What they know is that students care about careers. They begin thinking about those careers early. And so what they did is hung up pictures that represented different careers that they know students are interested in. And what they ask students at the beginning of a lesson is, hey, here's the outcome we're studying today. Which career do you think is most likely to use that particular outcome in its work? Like, how do you think a teacher uses the outcome that we learned today? Or how do you think a pilot uses the outcome that we're learning about today? The thinking is, let's get kids to recognize that these particular outcomes that we're studying in class are going to be important to you in the future. Because if students are interested in content and they realize that it matters to them, they're more likely to invest and engage in the learning that you're doing. Let me give you one final example. This is a group of primary teachers that I worked with up in Vermont, preschool teachers, and they changed the way that they chose read-aloud books for their classrooms. They had always chosen read-aloud books by theme, but what they've started to do is look for read-aloud books where the main character either was using their essential outcome or should have used their essential outcome. Why? Because they're trying to reinforce the point to students that what we do in school matters after we leave school as well. These are things that we'll use in order to be successful in our lives. When students become convinced that the things they're learning in school are going to be important later in their lives, they're more likely to be engaged in the learning that we're doing. All right, well, that's just 3 tips, right? I have so many more ideas that I'm willing to share with you. I actually do a 2-day workshop on student self-efficacy motivation. I'll put the dates down in the session description. I'll show you the slides for that particular workshop too. There's a lot more that I could possibly share, but for the sake of time, I'm going to stop our video now. I hope you'll run with one of those strategies. Remember that if a student recognizes that they're making contributions to the school community, and if a student recognizes that learning matters to them, not just because they have to pass class, but because this work is going to help them be successful in some way that they want to succeed, they're more likely to be both successful and engaged in our spaces.